Only in statistics would you have three different values to measure one idea. In this video, I'll introduce the three different statistical measures of center to you, show you how they differ, explain how they're interpreted, and help you decide which one is the best for you. Let's go.
Give me 6 minutes and I'll teach you something new. Now, let's get to work.
Hi, Mark here from 6 Minute Statistics. When we're talking about measures of center, I know one thing for sure. You must be working with quantitative data. In other words, numbers. Once we start collecting numerical information, it won't be long before someone wants to know where the center is. And that leads us to the first question. What does center even mean? Before I go there, a quick disclaimer. While my goal is to provide you with easy to understand information, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to avoid symbols and formulas entirely. We will look at them when I think there's some valuable information to be gained. So here goes. Let's start with some data. Looking at my last electric bill, it contains the electric usage for the last 13 months. We will refer to the electric usages as the values of a variable we want to learn about. We see that in June of 2021, for instance, my electric usage was 77 kilowatt hours per day. In July of the same year, that value jumped to 96 kilowatt hours per day. There are a total of 13 different values shown here, with the last being in June of 2022 with the usage of 109 kilowatt hours per day. In simple speak, we call these individual data values our X's. So we will say the first electric usage value of 77 is our value of X1, and I'll write that as X subscripted with 1. The second value, X2, is 96, etc., all the way through our last value, which I'll call X subscripted with 13, and that value is 109. Now back to the question I asked earlier. What do we mean by center? As with many things in statistics, that's not necessarily as straightforward as you might think. We're going to look at three different ways to talk about center. Correspondingly, we'll talk about three different measures of center. The first, and by far the most common, is called the mean. The mean is simply the average and is found by adding up all the values in our data and then dividing by the number of values that we added together. I could show you a formula for determining the mean, but the idea seems pretty simple, so I don't think it's needed. Here's where it gets tricky. The symbol that we use for the mean depends upon whether we're working with a population, which is the entire set of data we're interested in, or the sample, which is a subset taken from that population. If we're working with a population, we use the Greek letter mu to represent a population mean. If we're working with a sample, we use the symbol x bar. Now in our example, we're going to sum together the 13 electric usage values, and we're going to get a sum of 1,134. We then divide this by the 13 months that were collected, and we're going to find that the average from our sample was 87.231 kilowatt hours per day. Usually we're going to let some software do the math, but we're going to need to interpret the results. In this case, we interpret the mean to be the average electric usage of the 13 months sampled. The second way to look at center is to consider the middle value as a measure of center. We call this value the median. When we say middle, we first need to order the data from small to large. After doing that, we find the value that occurs in the middle. If, like in this example, there's an odd number of data values, the middle observation is simply chosen to be the median. If, on the other hand, there were an even number of observations, we would take the middle two values and average them together and call that the median. In this case, the median electric usage is 89 kilowatt hours per day. We interpret this value to indicate that half of the months sampled had an electric usage below 89 kilowatt hours per day, and half of the months had an electric usage above 89 kilowatt hours per day. The third and final, and least often used, measure of center is called the mode. It thinks of center as the value that occurs most often in our data set. We see in this particular data set that the only value to occur more than once was the value 77 kilowatt hours per day. That's going to be the mode of our data, the electric usage that occurs most often. Occasionally you'll have a data set where two values occur most often, and we would call that a bimodal distribution. If there were three, trimodal. Keep it simple. So there you have it. Three measures of center: mean, median, and mode. Hopefully it helps you understand what each of them are and how to interpret them. But I need to ask one last question. Which one's best? The answer to this question, again, is not as straightforward as we would like, because the best measure of center depends on the shape of the data set you're working with. When data is symmetric in nature, what that means is most of the data fall kind of in the middle, and then there are pretty similar amounts on either side or edge or tail of the distribution. We're going to say that the mean, the median, and the mode typically are pretty close together. In this situation, we're going to use the mean as our preferred measure of center. If, however, the data is what we call skewed, where most of the data form in one section, but one or the other of the sides or edges or tails of the distribution extends further than the other, well, in this case, the mean tends to scurry towards the tail. It tends to overemphasize the values in the tail, and we don't like it as much as a measure of center. In skewed distributions, we're going to use the median. And that leaves us with the mode. When do we use this? Well, not very often. Unless someone specifically wants to know what observation occurs most, we're going to either choose the mean or the median, and never the mode. And there you have it. Which measure is best is going to depend what the shape of your distribution is. In my electric usage example, the data is fairly symmetric, so I would use the mean of 87.231 kilowatt hours per day as my best guess at the center of the data. I hope that gives you a clearer picture of the different measures of center. You should understand how to find the values, how to interpret them, and then be able to decide which one is the best measure for you based on the shape of the data you're working with. Now it's time for you to get to work. So long.